world, global shocks similar to the pandemic will be far more likely. For example, the world currently faces growing crises in climate and nature. This year, countries across Europe and around the world have also felt the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so it is vital that we use what we have learned from the pandemic in dealing with these and other emergencies.
I don't think anybody expected there to be a pandemic, but one was inevitable. I think the issue now going forward as we emerge from the pandemic we've had is how we better prepared for the shock to the system, and that applies to any global shock. That's what I hope we are able to discuss in a non-judgmental fashion and learn some lessons that will be useful to every citizen and to all of society, and not just in Scotland.
So when I look back, I see enormous scientific discovery. I see resilience in families, in businesses, in children and adults, and I've met a host of people who have gone that extra mile to both care and treat and look after our population.
I don't think you could overestimate just how traumatic the pandemic has been for people in care homes and their relatives. I think there was an assumption that once people are in a care home, that their husbands, their wives, their daughters, their mothers, it's just not as important, but we were more important than any carer.
In social care, responding to the pandemic was like racing the tides up the sand. But instead of wet or dry feet, you were racing for life or death. So what's needed of us now is to rebuild from scratch, not build and repair. We need a new system, a system that's based on the plurality of responses that people need, not what the establishment thinks they should get.
Economic shocks, including the recent COVID-19 pandemic, typically widen inequalities, and we're seeing that once again with the cost of living crisis. So how to build resilience into our economy must be a priority in the years ahead. Likely reforms will come from many avenues, whether it be in the safety net provided during troubled times or tackling the root causes of inequalities from the outset.
You've got to be ready to prepare for, if you like, unknown unknowns. And I think the pandemic has taught us a lot of lessons about resilience and how to cope with these shocks.
We need to learn the lessons clearly from what we've done up until now and prepare and be more resilient as a country as we look ahead to the shocks that will come. We won't know from where, but they will come.
So a formal welcome from me now. My name's Jean Freeman. I'm privileged to work with the university, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what is the fifth in our series of events on future global shocks. I'm going to hand over shortly to my colleague Michael to talk a wee bit more about the thinking behind the series. But let me just say that this one, which is how can we make our economy more resilient, is as critical as all the ones that went before. There's been a number of global shocks that our country has faced. And the idea behind this is, what more do we need to do to be more resilient for the next one that comes along? To talk a wee bit more about that and what we've done so far before we begin this particular seminar, let me introduce Professor Michael Russell. Michael is Professor of Social Culture and Governance at the University of Glasgow. He was an MSP for almost 20 years, much of that in Scottish Government, and he is also a writer, was a television producer, is a published author, and currently is working on a book on Scotland and Brexit. Michael.
Thank you very much, Jean. I will be very brief, but a senior civil servant whom I once worked with used to say that you should never put a good crisis to waste. It's a very cynical remark, but it does have within it a grain of truth, and the grain of truth is we must learn from what we have been through and apply that learning for the future. And that's the basis for this series of events. In conversation with Graham Roy and then with Jean, it seemed to me that those of us who had, and we've all had, experience of the pandemic, have stories to tell from that pandemic in one way or another. Either things we had to do, and Jean, of course, was health secretary at the time, and I was involved very heavily in the legislative side and taking through the emergency legislation and the regulations. Others have different experiences, and many have very personal experiences. If we could find a non-judgmental way of hearing those stories and listening to the experiences that took place, and if we could engage those who were looking backwards to say, what should we learn from this pandemic, again in a non-judgmental way, we might come out with some material and information that was of value to the future. And that is the basis of what we're trying to do. This is the fifth of these events. This was to be the first of these events, but the Queen's death prevented us taking place at the end of September. There is one more event to go, which will round everything up. And at that event, I hope we will show the film, but upgraded with a number of other contributions, including, I'm glad to say, Anthony Fauci, who's agreed to be filmed for the series, giving his reflections on what happened, how he saw the pandemic. Of course, he's a vitally important global voice in what took place. We have discussed public health. We have discussed disablement. We have discussed communities and rural activity. And we have discussed legislation and the passage of legislation and the way in which legislation should be scrutinized. Tonight, we're going to look at the economy, and the last one will bring everything together. In addition to the film, there will be, I'm glad to say, a written report on the series, which will try to draw out the themes that we have identified. And it'll be interesting to see tonight if any of the themes so far dovetail with what we're going to hear. Two in particular occur to me from what I've heard in the first four. One is the way in which governments were able to break down the barriers between the parts of government very, very quickly indeed in order to meet real need. And that comes across particularly in one session we had where we heard about rough sleeping and the way in which that was solved, not forever, but as an immediate problem within days because the old silos no longer existed. And the other one, and a slightly perhaps surprising one, is the way in which the systems of government and administration changed to identify individuals as those who should be served. Not groups, not collectives, but individuals. And those individuals had individual and unique need and needed to be addressed. And to a greater or lesser extent, that worked in the early part of the pandemic, certainly in Scotland, but has perhaps begun to be eroded as we've gone back to traditional patterns of working. I look forward to hearing what happens tonight and how the issues develop. There are questions, obviously, and will be questions from people here and also from online, and we have a sizable online audience. And then we will move forward to produce the final film, to produce a report on the events, and to draw everything together at an early date next year. But thank you, and thank you, Jean.
Thanks very much, Michael. What we're going to do tonight is we've got two guest speakers. But we've also got a short film from Professor Linda Yu, which I'll introduce. We'll hear from all of them, and then we'll take questions from yourselves, but also from our online audience. And I should make a point of welcoming that online audience. My apologies for not doing that earlier. And also should say before we kick off properly that we're working here in partnership with the Campaign for Social Science, which highlights the value of applied social science research, advocating for its greater use in decision-making and government. But let's start now with the first of our guest speakers tonight, and that is Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli, known to many of you, I'm sure, as the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Glasgow. Anton is an economist. His research interests are monetary economics, central bank independence, fiscal policy, international finance, and macroeconomics. And let me say that he is the only economist so far, I've not read you, Richard, but I'm looking forward to it, but he's the only economist so far that I've actually understood what he was writing about. He was chair of the First Minister's Standing Council on Europe. He has been a member of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisers, special advisor to the House of Commons Treasury Select Committee, advised on the European Commission and the World Bank, and he also holds an honorary degree from McGill's University in Canada. There's much more besides, but let that do for now, and my pleasure to ask Anton to give us his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Jean, and thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction to the series and to myself. It's a real pleasure to be here. Can I actually, on behalf of the university, welcome you to the Mazumdar Shaw Advanced Research Centre. I think it's our first time here for this series, and it's great to be here because it is actually a building designed for collaborative discussions, a collaborative space. And your point, Jean, about the importance of social sciences and that social science is a key part in this space. What I want to do tonight is just reflect on a number of lessons that we've learned over the last few years from both the pandemic and indeed more recently the war on Ukraine, and what it tells us about the way in which we need to think about the resilience of our macroeconomy. Some of you may know, but those of you who haven't sort of studied economics may know that actually macroeconomics, the way in which governments manage their economy, it's not actually that recent a branch of economics. It really finds its roots in the late 1930s. And it was partly as a result of the Great Depression and the notion that perhaps economies aren't self-stabilizing after all, that led John Maynard Keynes to write his general theory, which really recast the thinking around how macroeconomies work. And actually, after the war, after 1945, led to governments across the world playing a much more active role in managing their economies. And that post-war era arguably was then characterized by, certainly in the advanced economies, in the advanced industrialized economies, until the 1970s and 80s, by a period of greater stability. And then, of course, we had the oil shocks, and these led to some questioning about how the economy worked. But actually, after the oil shocks came through, we had a period between the late 1980s and the early 90s to 2007, which is now known as the Great Moderation, a period in which actually we thought we'd solved the problem of boom and bust. And instead, in fact, we haven't, of course, and we're now subject to shocks. And I think the great financial crisis of 2007-8 brought us down to earth again. And of course, we've since had COVID, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has really made us question to what extent we need to manage our economies and how they can be made more resilient. So what I'd like to talk about in my bit is really what lessons can we learn from these three major shocks and what can we think about in terms of resilience. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I've articulated this around 5 lessons, and actually there's many more lessons than just 5 lessons you'll be glad to know from the last 2 decades, but I thought I would just focus on some. The first lesson, as you can read, is really when major shocks happen, they have a global impact. And most countries really find it difficult to insulate fully. So yes, unless it's a very specific shock, more than likely it will have a global impact. And that's one of the lessons from both COVID and the recent invasion of Ukraine. If we come to COVID, if we come to the next slide, please. Actually, COVID pretty much impacted on every country on Earth, but its impact was not even. This slide, I think, shows us quite well. This shows you what happened to GDP, to employment, to hours worked in a number of the advanced economies, the industrialized advanced economies. I could have shown you a similar graph for some of the low and middle income countries. And this is taken between 2019 last quarter, which is just before the pandemic hit, to the middle of 2021. So we're not quite out of the pandemic. And you can see the very different experience. Countries like Denmark, Australia, to some extent the USA as well, certainly in terms of GDP, having less of an impact, although the US did have an employment impact. Whilst at the right-hand side, you see countries much more deeply affected. So, and the reason why there was a differential effect is that partly due to geography, some of the countries on the left, particularly Australia and Denmark, had a different impact in terms of how the pandemic entered. Of course, Australia quite geographically insulated itself, partly because its exports are actually mainly raw materials, so they could do a lot of this by closing down the economy to travel. But countries like Denmark actually being very flexible, they avoided one whole wave by essentially shutting down very quickly, but then opening up very quickly. So you know, a lot of different policies across these countries. And But on the other hand, you see the huge impact this had. And if we go to the next slide, we see just how expensive this was. I mean, essentially, in terms of what COVID did to all of the economies around the world, and this is showing the advanced economies again, just because we're probably more familiar with them, it was akin to the impact of a short war. Most countries intervened very quickly and very expensively to protect employment, to protect businesses. And of course, for some, this was hugely expensive as a percentage of GDP. And to some extent, that's proportional, of course, to the shock. You see countries like Denmark and Sweden intervene less because they had to intervene less. Now, if you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we see a similar differential effect. We see a huge spike in gas, energy prices, but also in raw materials, food, commodities like steel, concrete, a lot of metals produced actually, which are important for all sorts of industrial processes there. And it's felt throughout the world economy, in fact. In the UK, we've seen inflation hit 11.1% in November, but it is a global phenomenon. And indeed, many of the poorest countries in the world are facing real restrictions because of shortage in foreign exchange reserves, but also because they need to prioritize food imports. And many of them, indeed, are suffering famine conditions. So a really, really serious impact. And I think the point is that not everybody gets hit in the same way. It depends very much on where the shock hits. And I'm going to come back to this because in terms of the energy price shock, it hasn't impacted in the same way across the world. And it's something which we need to consider if we want to talk about resilience. Moving to the next slide, I think this is one of the key issues in terms of trying to build up resilience. If you want resilience in the macroeconomy to deal with unanticipated shocks like COVID, like the Ukraine war, you need to have fiscal space or need to create fiscal space. We've been reminded of this recently in the UK with the Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng mini budget, because that caused a real crisis, immediate crisis, both in terms of the pound on foreign exchanges, but more importantly, what happened to UK bond markets, which eventually led to the collapse of that particular government after only a few days. Let me move to the next slide. One of the things about COVID is that it's led most of the countries around the world who have tried to offset the effects to take on more debt. So this plots debt to GDP ratios, and you see that a number of countries are now have debt to GDP ratios which were much higher now than they were in the mid-80s. And indeed, in some cases, that spike is taking them into the kind of, for Italy and France, is taking them to territory where the debt to GDP ratio is well over 100%. It's actually, for Italy, it's now about 150%, which means it makes them very subject to slight changes in the real rate of interest relative to the rate of growth. If we move to the next slide, as I said, aside from the pandemic, a major factor here in the last couple of years has been the energy shock. There are differential effects, and this is really interesting because I think this chart will come back to haunt us a bit over the next few years. Europe has been much more affected because of its dependence on gas, and because it sources most of its gas, of course, from Russia. And you see that actually in terms of how it's impacted on the US and Japan, it's been much less. And this is something which we need to think about in terms of resilience as well. I think Europe could potentially bear the brunt of energy prices much more severely also going into winter 2023. And I think we should come back to this during the discussion. Clearly, there is a political debate to be had around the scope of governmental responses, but I think in looking purely at the scale of the response, most of the countries that have been subject in Europe to this shock have actually dealt with it reasonably well. You can argue whether the UK should have perhaps weighted more of its response towards low-income families. You can argue whether the size of the response should have been bigger. But actually, the UK's measures so far in terms of energy capping in the recent budget has been about 3.5% of GDP. So it's a pretty sizable response, pretty much in line with France at about 2.8% of GDP, and Spain at 3.2%. But actually, Germany has spent about 7%. And partly Germany is one of the countries, and it was a previous chart, has a lower debt to GDP ratio. So it has more space to be able to do something here. So moving on to the next slide, we see that takes us, I think, to lesson 3. And an important variable which really impacts on the debt to GDP ratio is what happens to the denominator of that ratio, i.e. what happens to GDP. If you can't get economic growth to pick up following whatever shock hits you, then you're in trouble in terms of managing your fiscal space. In fact, what the two variables would really do matter in this space, as I said, is the comparison between your real rate of interest and your real rate of growth. Unless growth keeps ahead of that real rate of interest, you find that your debt to GDP ratio accumulates much more fast. And I think, what we need to think is that if you've got to bring in more income as a result, if you can't manage growth well, and I think this is one of the problems certainly the UK, but also some other Western economies have had, then you need to think about your tax base. You need to think about restructuring your tax base. One of the big issues in the UK, for instance, is the fact that our property taxes are quite regressive compared to a lot of the other OECD countries. We have a system where we have separate taxation on labour income, national insurance, and income on across both labour and other income, i.e. income taxes. We don't tend to have much in terms of wealth taxes, partly because of how our property taxes work. And you need to think about that as a country, especially given what Graham Roy said in the opening film, which is that if you have a shock, it's likely to have an impact on inequality. So we need to be mindful of inequality during major economic shocks. They tend to impact on those who have the least bargaining power. We're seeing that again during this inflation shock, because it's those with the weakest bargaining power whose real wages will tend to fall behind. And we need to look, I think, and we'll come back to this, I think, in discussion, what we do around the taxation base. If we move to the next slide, I think one of the key variables for the UK, certainly, because it's the worst affected, although, as I say, there's some similar worrying patterns across the Western world. As we discuss post-pandemic recovery, we need to think, if we want to think about growth, we need to think about productivity growth. This actually gives you an idea of just how far off we are, not from our level of GDP before the shock in the UK, the US and the Eurozone, but how far off we are where we would have been had we carried on growing at our pre-COVID shocks rate. Where the UK is just about back to where it was in level terms, as is the Eurozone, but the US has recovered much more, and where all three big areas are short in terms of where they would have been. If we go to the next slide, as I've said, the UK, as I said in other talks, the UK's productivity conundrum is a really worrying element here. So growth is made up of different components, and one of them is how productive are you? So for a given amount of labor, for a given amount of investment, how much do you produce with that? And the UK, pretty much since the great financial crisis, has really flatlined in terms of productivity, labor productivity. And some of that is due to this element in blue, which is called capital deepening, which is to do with investment. But some of it is to do with a bit in yellow, which is a bit more complicated. It's called MFP in this. It means multi-factor productivity. It's to do with a whole bunch of factors: innovation, how much we invest in R&D, and solving this is going to be an issue to be resilient in future. If we're hit by another shock, or if this shock we're currently undergoing in terms of what is happening with the war on Ukraine, if, for instance, these energy price shocks and commodity price shocks keep hitting us in the next couple of years, how resilient will we be if our GDP isn't growing very much? If I move on to, and I think, one of the issues around, before I move to this lesson, actually, one of the points I wanted to make is that people often think productivity is quite an abstract concept, but it's very real. It's what ends up paying for our public services. And actually, there's a nice quote from Andy Haldane, who used to be chief economist of the Bank of England, is now chief executive of the RSA. And he put it this way: he said, productivity is what pays for pay rises. It's difficult to see rising standards of living unless you can drive productivity up. And in fact, some would argue that there was that sluggishness in productivity in the UK between 2006 and the Brexit referendum that may have actually triggered Brexit, because it actually kept certainly median wages in the UK quite low. Now, as a penultimate lesson, I want to cover the issue of policy errors and scrutiny, because I think at times of economic volatility, these errors tend to be more frequent. I mentioned the mini budget already, but actually, if you look at other periods of volatility, we do see some policy errors. If you look at the UK between 1979 and 81, the Thatcher government tried to deal with the big inflationary shock, but what it did actually caused a very big appreciation in sterling, given the policy mix it chose, which arguably accelerated deindustrialization in the UK. And you will see similar policy errors across many other industrialized countries if you analyze periods of great volatility. And I think what this tells us is that I think policymakers have to be much more humble. They have to be willing to subject themselves to scrutiny. For obvious reasons, political parties don't relish this if they're incumbent parties. Actually, to give you one obvious area where we did make some policy mistakes, and it wasn't just the UK, across the piece. If we go to the next slide. Yes, I know you'll hear a lot about policymakers now blaming the invasion of Ukraine by Russia for the inflationary shock, but actually it was already in train before. It was already, the inflation upsurge was already in train before that happened. This is a chart from the OECD, which showed you in late 2021, before there was any sign or even threat of invasion of Ukraine. Well, there might have been a threat, but there wasn't any movement at all. You see just how many firms, certainly in the Eurozone, were experiencing production and material constraints. And those yellow bars are the constraints. About 80% of motor vehicle companies, about 60% of electrical equipment company, and the green bars is what you would normally expect in terms of supply constraints. So we were heading for inflation anyway. And actually, if I showed you an energy price chart, well, I did show you it earlier, it was rising, energy prices were rising even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there were policy errors. Our monetary policy was probably too loose in 2021. But politically, it would have been quite difficult for many central banks to act. So if we move to the next slide again, to conclude, I wanted to highlight this point because in the face of major exogenous shocks such as pandemics and wars, I think there's a limit to what macroeconomic policy can do. But I think there are lessons from the last 2 years about the policies which will create more resilience. And there are much sterner, I think, tests ahead. COVID was difficult to anticipate, although we now know much more about zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to humans, and actually they're more frequent than the risks are more frequent than we might expect. And I think we need to expect further shocks ahead. And this takes me to this last lesson because it's to do with our democratic institutions. During the pandemic, we saw some limits to collective action. Although I think it was Michael said earlier, within advanced economies, we saw some breaking down of silos. Internationally, collective action did actually break down. If you look at how many vaccines reached low and middle income countries, it was actually quite scandalous that despite the fact that this would have cost just a handful of billions to engineer, and it could have saved many, many millions of lives around the world, it also would have damaged many low and middle income economies far less if we managed to provide more vaccine supplies to the developing world. And similarly, I think we now face a real problem with the Ukraine war in terms of how it's impacting low and middle income country. And I think climate change is really quite scary indeed with how it will drive inequality across countries. If you go to the next chart, this is a slide which probably, you've seen many climate change slides, but this is one of the ones I find really scary. It's one which comes from the Global Carbon Project, which is run by the University of Exeter and a number of other institutions. And it's based on the IPCC report on the carbon budget. And it shows you just how little of a carbon budget we have left if we really want to meet or have 50% chance of meeting the Paris 1.5 degrees target. It's the green path. This is the time, by 2040, we need to get CO2 emissions pretty much to zero. That black line tells you what has happened over the last few years. And you see COVID is a little blip. It's no more than a little blip. We're right back up to emitting more than we did even before COVID. So we're not really addressing this. And you've got to remember that if we want to get to zero here collectively across the globe, some of that carbon budget has to be used actually to produce the renewable energy infrastructure that we want to actually keep us at zero once we're there. Get us to zero and then keep us there. And of course, there are a number of activities which will require some carbon going into the future, even after 2040 or 2050, depending which path you choose, because things like agriculture will require some carbon budget. And I think, as I say, inequality here is really quite concerning, because if you look at the UK, the Climate Change Committee has estimated we need to spend about 15 billion per year by 2035 to achieve net zero. Now, that's doable given, that's a manageable proportion of GDP, given what we've spent, although we need to get our growth going. But geopolitically, that is really quite a challenge because, and as I say, I think that will create real tensions. If you look at the poorest countries in the world, the World Bank estimates that they probably, because they're so far behind in terms of renewable investment, they need to invest about 8% of their GDP yearly between 2023 to 2030 to get to net zero on these kind of paths. That's just unimaginable. They can't do that without help from the north, from the global north. And I think we need to learn that, and we need to do something about that. The other thing I worry about in terms of collective action is the divergence which some of these shocks impose. You'll know, for instance, that the US has recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is trying to boost what is happening in terms of renewable, which is great. However, because of the impact it will have on the geography of investment, it could draw capital away from Europe. So actually, in many respects, the lack of collective action in Europe, which we've seen in the last few months following the spike in energy prices, could see us actually perhaps losing ground in terms of what happens here. And if you compare that to what is happening in Asia in terms of investment, actually there are some worrying patterns here. So as a final thought, sorry, and I have gone on for slightly longer than I planned, I want to get back to this issue of institutions, because does the way we run our democratic institutions, which are based on short-term electoral objectives, make it difficult to take these kind of long-term decisions? The answer is probably yes. So what do we do about it? And the only way, you see that in the UK at the moment, for instance, when we're talking about the difficulty of creating more onshore wind farms, where perhaps even more bewilderingly this week, there's the UK government is thinking about a new coal mine to perhaps get the go-ahead in Cumbria. Now, if we accept that making the right long-term decisions and potentially foregoing short-term political imperatives is necessary, then how do we change that democratic decision-making to ensure that we will save humanity and we'll do it in a way that is equitable across the world? Economists do think about these things. Political economy models do talk about this. And the way you do it is by governments tying their own hands, essentially, by trying to weight future generations' hopes and ambitions into decision-making now by more regulation, essentially, that ties governments from doing that. You need probably greater cross-party collaboration along deciding what these regulations should be and how governments should tie their hands going forward. Now, let me put up the final slide. I'm not going to talk to it. These are the kind of conclusions that come from the 5 points. As I said, there's many other areas that I think one could discuss around resilience and the macroeconomy and where we are following these two major shocks. But I think this is probably some areas that we may want to discuss, Jean. So thank you.
Anton, thank you very much. There's so much there to think about and discuss. And I think as well as putting this event up online later, which we will do, we may want to, with your agreement, incorporate some of those slides. I'd certainly like to read them again. So now we are going to have a short contribution in film from Professor Linda Yu. Michael said earlier that this event on the economy was intended to be the first in our global shock series, but it was postponed because of the Queen's death. Linda was due to be with us at that first event. Couldn't be at this rearranged date, but she's very kindly given us a short film with some of the key points that she wants to make. I should just tell you before we see that she is a fellow in economics at St Edmund Hall in Oxford University and adjunct professor of economics at the London Business School. She's also an advisor to the UK Board of Trade, is again another widely published author who's written or edited 11 books. And her latest book, which is out on the 18th of May next year, is called The Great Crashes, Lessons from Global Crashes and How to Prevent Them. Very timely indeed, actually. She's also a TV and radio presenter with Radio 4 and much else besides. But for now, let's see that film.
I'm Linda Yu, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts about what's been learned from the pandemic. I think the main lesson is to support people to be attached, to remain attached to the labor force, even amidst lockdowns, and to support viable businesses so that they can withstand the closure of their businesses for a period of time, as well as maintaining financial stability. And that is what central banks around the world did, including in the UK. On the first two, trying to keep viable businesses afloat through fiscal support, the government also deployed a furlough scheme. The furlough scheme meant that even though people were not working, they were still kept in employment because the government subsidized 80% of their wages. Now, that was learned from Denmark, which had a similar scheme, which supported 75% of people's wages. And of course, in the continent, in countries like Germany, they have short-time work. So that means that even if there's only part-time work available, people are kept in full-time employment. All of these policies are crucially important to prevent hysteresis. That's when a short-term shock, like a pandemic and lockdowns, ends up damaging an economy's long-run growth potential, because the short-term shock makes people discouraged, they lose skills, and they leave the labor force. So that means if fiscal policy is deployed quickly, and that is a lesson that we learned from the pandemic, which is fiscal policy can be used, can be deployed quickly, that is very important to make sure that there's no scarring, no lasting damage to the economy. Of course, the UK is facing a higher level of economic inactivity as we come out of the pandemic. But the furlough scheme did prevent unemployment from spiking. Now, as I've already mentioned, other economies deploy different versions of the scheme. And to me, this is the most important lesson from the pandemic, which is we typically think of monetary policy acting quickly. Fiscal policy operates with a lag, both a recognition lag, in other words, legislatures have to devise a program and then they have to implement it. So there's also an implementation lag. But what we saw during the pandemic is that it is possible to deploy fiscal policy rapidly. And as we look forward and we want to maintain a level of preparedness for the next global negative economic shock, whether that's a pandemic or a climate crisis or something different altogether, the ability to quickly use economic policies, monetary and fiscal, to support people and to support the economy. To me, that's the most important lesson that we saw during the pandemic, and I hope has been learned as we look forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Linda, and we'll go straight on to our final speaker, who is Professor Richard Davis. Richard is an economist and an author. He's currently director of the UK's Economics Observatory. He's a professor at Bristol University and a research fellow at the Centre for Economic Performance, which is part of the London School of Economics. He's been chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the Treasury and economics editor of The Economist. His recent book, Extreme Economics, is now published and is here, but it won the Lonely Planet Stanford's Prize for debut travel writing, which I think ensures actually that it's going to be pretty widely read. And I know that Richard is particularly pleased about that. I think it's a good thing. The more people read economics books, the better. But also widely featured in terms of his writings across a range of publications from the New York Times, The Economist, the Financial Times, The Guardian, the Sunday Times, The Times, and so on. So Richard, we're delighted that you're here with us tonight and look forward now to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Yeah, shameless plug, Extreme Economies. I do have some copies if anyone would like a signed copy. Make good Christmas presents. And there's a chapter all about Glasgow, which is, I argue, one of the world's 9 most extreme economies. So just some things to say, like being third in line means that I had to kind of adapt what I was saying. And what I'm going to try and do is just outline a few stories. You know, I'm not really a proper academic economist. I'm partly a journalist, and so I like stories. And I wasn't being rude checking my phone there, not listening to Linda. I was actually just checking some facts because I want to tell a story at the start, which is actually a bit pessimistic. And it's really in reaction to Anton's presentation, where he set out these challenges that we have. And when I was at The Economist, I had the fortune of interviewing a CEO, a guy called Tony Pidgley. Ever come across Tony Pidgley? You'd remember if you did, Anton. He was born, he was an orphan. He was adopted from Bernardes. I've just checked this. He was your sort of ultimate Essex geezer. And when I tell his story after a few drinks, I kind of do the accent, but I'm not going to do it here. But the point is, he built from nothing. He lived in a railway arch or a railway carriage as a child. And he built up Berkeley Homes, the house builder. And he ended up the FTSE's highest paid CEO. And I interviewed him about housing policy. And the thing he said, he just sat back and he just said to me, Richard, it's just brick on brick, right? And whenever we get to challenges like the ones Anton set out, which are multifaceted, multi-year, multi-country, I just always remember the story of Tony Pidgley. I don't need to tell you guys in Glasgow, we can't even, as human beings in 2022, get housing policy right. And Tony Pidgley's told us it's just brick on brick. So that's my opening pessimistic stance. I think things are actually pretty bad. Like if we can't get housing policy right, how are we going to solve your climate your crisis? So that's my pessimistic point. And I'm going to try and tell you what I think is a way forward. So if we could have the first slide and the next one. So the book, the idea with the book, which I did just before the crisis, but a reason I want to talk about it is because I think it's really relevant. It's all about resilience, was to go to places where people had faced a really extreme shock and something we could learn from. So these guys are in Louisiana, and they're in a maximum security jail where they'll live the rest of their lives. And their lives have been completely changed by incarceration. Next slide. This are the scenes in Chile, particularly in Santiago, where young people, you mentioned intergenerational concerns, Anton, I think that's exactly right. Young people have become hugely involved in politics, and Chile now has a 35-year-old president because of this. And this is all driven by inequality, okay? Next slide. Some people will remember this slide, this picture. This was one of the ultimate motivations for the book. This is Aceh in Indonesia, and it's the place in Indonesia that was closest to the 2004 tsunami waves. There was the offshore earthquake in the wave. Every single house was destroyed, every shop, every school, every farm animal was killed. The only thing that remained was this mosque, okay? So these are the kind of situations people find themselves going through. And my question is, can we learn from them? Next slide. That's just some stuff about me. If you want to find out about the book, if you think these points are interesting, extremeeconomies.com. Next slide, please. Glasgow features really heavily in the book for two reasons. The first one is that I think we need, this is moving to my proposal, we need some new, which are actually old approaches. In economics and in economic policy, we base ourselves essentially on the median, okay? We think, because we have to think about everybody in the economy and we can't have a separate policy for everybody, we think about the median or the average, okay? When was the last time you told somebody a story or you learned about something when it was average? That's not how we act as human beings. We learn from the extreme events we go through. When we tell a story, we tell a story of some extreme thing that happened to us, some interesting that happened to us. And this has been known and it's used extensively in science, where of course, they do big studies with lots and lots of patients and so on, but some of the biggest breakthroughs in science are in medicine, for example, are through patients that have had these bizarre things happen to them. Some of you who know Oliver Sacks's work, for example, will know the story of Phineas Gage. It's a bit of a gory story. This guy, railroad worker, who had a metal pylon thing shot through his head, and it severed his brain, but he lived. And that's how we came up with lots of our developments in terms of understanding how the brain works. Similarly, next slide, please, they know about it in engineering. So in the mid-1800s, because of the Industrial Revolution, because of actually many of the benefits and the developments that had happened in this city, particularly I'm talking about the steam engine, they were getting bigger, they were getting faster, they were getting more powerful. And there was this era of extreme accidents. And if you look into it, you can find about it. It started actually not in Scotland, it started in northern France, where there was something called the Versailles disaster, where basically all the great and the good from Paris had gone to Versailles for some booze up, I don't know what they're doing. And they came back on this special train, and the train's axle broke. Again, engines had got so much more powerful that we were just sending trains much more quickly than previously, and there were these accidents. And this science developed of really understanding exactly what had gone wrong when something had gone wrong. And the person who perfected that science is David Kirkcaldy. He was born in Dundee, actually, but he worked here in Glasgow as an apprentice. And then he developed down in London something in Southwark called his testing machine, which is this massive contraption, which is kind of water powered, builds up pressure, and it destroys metal. And he would then collect the fragments, and what he was destroying was rail axles, because these were things that are breaking. And then he'd collect them and look at them, and he called it the Black Museum. And it was in Southwark. He actually collected these fragments from disasters because he thought we could really learn from disasters. Unfortunately, that museum was destroyed in the Blitz. So this is an old idea, the idea of looking at extremes. It's right through engineering. This is how using the descendants of this testing machine is how we test now, for example, spacesuits and things. And it's intuitive. Like if you want to make sure an astronaut's not going to die in the spacesuit, you sort of stretch it and see how hard it will go. We can't do that in economics. So how can we use this idea of looking at the extremes to our benefit? Next slide. And next slide. So what I did is look at 9 tests of resilience in 9 places. Sorry, next slide. The really important point I want to leave you with, if there are 2 sort of twin points. One, I don't think we're very good at doing this stuff, by which I mean long-term economic policy planning. We focus on monetary policy and fiscal policy, the economic cycle. That's what all our discussion is. But Anton's points are really long-term things. We're not very good at them. In some sense, luckily, I argue, we know what they are. We know the things that are coming. It's the aging society. It's the role of technology, particularly software, labor-saving software, but also robots and so on. And it's an inequality. And I think it's actually not primarily inequality in places like Scotland or England or Wales. It's in places like Chile, in Nigeria, in Kenya, places that have been promised that they will be the next growth hubs of the world. And actually the inequality there is leading to much more than dissatisfaction, it's leading to violence. So we know where we're going. Next slide, please. So the way I did it was to try and think, okay, if we know the resilience, so that's how our resilience will be tested. And of course, it will be tested in other ways we don't know, but we know that it will definitely be tested in these 3 ways. So how can we think about resilience? Well, we can think about it in 2 ways. One, as we can think of amazing acts of survival. And so there are 3, some of them I kind of knew about as an economist anyway, But I kind of sat down and thought, what are the big things? What are the things that can happen to you? Well, one, natural disaster. 2, civil war, kind of having to flee your home, particularly life as a refugee. And then the third one, incarceration, where you, in all 3 of these situations, you lose your economy completely and you get sort of set back to zero. Yet people tend to rebuild and survive in those situations. Next slide, please. The flip side of that is places where there have been incredible successes, incredible potentials, but then that hasn't been built on. And sadly, Glasgow is one of these examples, as I argue in the book. And that's the failure here in this city of industry, by which I mean the fact that Glasgow 100 years, not 100 years ago, 120 years ago was, and many people in this room will know about this better than me, but it was the equivalent of Silicon Valley. It was where you wanted to go and move if you wanted to get ahead in the world. The gifts to the world, frankly, in terms of science, in terms of engineering, and way beyond that in terms of art. You know, Glaswegian taste, in particular, the taste for impressionistic paintings, because there was such wealth in this city, shifted the way people thought about art. But we all know that since then, and particularly through the 60s, 80s, 90s, Glasgow had a much more difficult time in terms of economics. But there are others as well, so in terms of poverty and in terms of failures of the environment. So basically, I chose these 9 themes, which I think are relevant tests, and you might choose different ones, but I know you're putting together a report on this, and I do think it would be worth trying to work out, okay, we're not just going to try and learn from COVID. What is the next thing? Like, what is the thing that we think is going to happen? These are my 3, and these are some other ones that can happen that we can learn from. And then what I did, so I did that just based on like thinking things through. I literally did a very, very quantitative exercise in finding out, okay, what is the biggest example of environmental failure? What is the biggest example of a civil war where people have had to kind of rebuild their lives? And then I went to those places. So next slide, please. And so these are all the places I went to. And I spent time in each, and I interviewed at least 50 people in each. So the book, in the end, was over 500 interviews, and that's something I'll briefly return to in my conclusions. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so this randomly, I promise this was random because I picked the themes first, and then I worked out what was the most extreme example. Randomly, they ended up kind of dotted all over the world, so you can see where we are. Yeah, I promised you that I thought Glasgow was a very special city, and you can see it. You can see it there. Okay, so what happens in these places? And I'll go fast now because I know I want to move to discussion. If we go to the next slide, let's just look at one. Actually, jump ahead again, please. Okay, so this is the place that we're going to and to ask what happened. Next slide. So this is exactly where we are in the world. This is the epicenter of the earthquake off the north west coast of Indonesia. And this is a kind of focused in bit. And I was here in these 2 villages, Lampuk and Loknar, literally bearing the brunt of the tsunami wave. It was the biggest tsunami wave on record. And people died in Sri Lanka, Thailand. People died all the way across the other side of the Indian Ocean in Somalia. But it was Indonesia. It was really an Indonesian disaster. And actually, really, it was this spot. So 200,000 people died in this region. Okay, next slide. This is the kind of scene shortly afterwards. Next slide. And next slide. What you still see today are things like this throughout the region. There are huge tankers, miles and miles inland. This one's actually quite close to the coast that will never be able to move because no cranes exist that can. I mean, you could move that with a crane, but there's one in the middle of far inside that's a huge tanker that will never move. Unless what happened on that day, again, another wave comes, and the waves in this region were 90 feet high, and they know that because scientists have been able to go up into these hills in the background, and you can see in the background, and measure how high up the salt water was. So they faced 90 feet waves. Okay, so you can't imagine, but that was what these people faced. Next slide. And this was the photo the second photo that made me want to go there. This is a Credit Guardian. It's the same place. You can see this was 10 years later, completely rebuilt. So how did it happen? Next slide. This is one that I took. So you can see I'm not as good a Photoshop of my colors and stuff. But here we are. And you can see there's a paved road, the mosque there. They've got power lines, they've got cattle, they've got motorbikes and so on. How did it happen? Next slide. Two big things, because I think they're really widely apply to COVID. The first is the importance of stories. So the whole book and the whole approach in this area of my work that I do is completely based on qualitative gathering of information. And I think we need to do much more of that as economists. I don't think it happens at all, really. And the first story I open up with is this guy. He's called Suryandi. He actually, it took me about 3 weeks to find him, or to find people like him, but I did find him. He actually saw the wave. And he was on the beach. They could see it coming, and he escaped on a motorbike. He escaped because of a motorbike. He climbed up like a mobile phone mast thing they have there. Like they have these sort of scaffolding type things. He climbed up that and it didn't fall down, and he lived. And he told me about how he rebuilt his life. Okay, so this is like really, if you want to understand resilience, his story should be weighted pretty highly. Next slide. This is his cafe today. You can see there are people all around having a nice time there back on the beach. Next slide. Okay. Really important slide, I think penultimate one as well. I just want to mention, because it's sort of why I think this is relevant. So how did it happen? Like how were they able to rebuild so quickly? Of course, there was lots of aid money, but Aceh is very, like Glasgow, is a trading city, and I haven't got evidence of it, but I guarantee that somebody in this city, in the old city, will have traded with Aceh. And the reason for that is that in the 1600s, Aceh was hugely well known, and it kind of dominated the world market for pepper. It had more than 50% of the world's supply for pepper. So traders in London knew all about Aceh. Economists, if they didn't call themselves, in the 1600s would have known all about this place. It grew very rich, and it developed its own system of weights and measures that are different from everywhere else, and they're based on gold. And it's called the Mayam system. The Mayam system exists today, and the way it plays out is that women, when they get married, they get given a gold bangle, a very thick, chunky bangle. And they're not really these ones, they're these at the back here. And this is different. This sort of thing happens in lots of places in the world, but this is different in Aceh. It's not like a dowry. It's not owned. It's not from father to father. It's owned and controlled by the woman. They have a history they're a military and seafaring nation, a very, very strong woman. They have the world's first female admiral. Her name's Maya Hayakelati. Look her up. She's incredible boss of ships, basically, all around the region. Anyway, so they have this thing on their wrist. In today's money, it's worth about the equivalent of a worker's wages. Sorry, a year of a construction worker's wages, okay, on your wrist. And this is the key to why I think this is an important story. When the tsunami struck, of course there was aid, but lots of the people, including Suryandi that I talked to, didn't get given any aid. Small businesses didn't get given any aid. What actually happened was people sold their gold. So this system, this traditional system, turned out to be also a system of insurance, and it worked incredibly well. Why did it work so well? Because gold is an international market. These people were able to call their colleagues down in Jakarta. Jakarta's on the other side of Indonesia, wasn't affected by the tsunami wave, and able to sell this gold. and they use that to rebuild. Okay, so that's a nice enough story. Why is this relevant to COVID? Why is this relevant to everyone? It's relevant because it's exactly the opposite of the advice that you or I, Anton, and people we've worked with in central banking, in the IMF, in the World Bank, and so on, have been taught to actually to push, really, to tell people to do. The economist story would be, this is a very rudimentary system. It's much better to have a banking system. Rather than save like this, you should put all of your money in a bank, and then the bank can lend it on, and that creates investment and so on. And of course, in general, that's right, okay? But what happens in a scenario where every single house is destroyed? What happens to your mortgage market? There is no mortgage market. The houses are all gone. And this traditional piece of economics turned out to be an absolute key to their resilience. And it was hidden, and you only find it if you go there and talk to people. And that's my kind of key message about what we need to learn from COVID. It goes back to your point about individuals. There are elements of economics that are embedded and hidden in people's stories. I won't go over it now, but I also heard it very, very clearly in this city from people talking about the destruction of the tenements and the tenement system, how the top-down planning. Of course, I'm not here to say that tenements were nice places to live. Let's take that as given. But the top-down planning ignored things like this, things like tradition, things like norms, things like social capital. And it did that because nobody had gone into those communities and properly understood the way that the labour market actually worked, the way that the loan system, the so-called menage system in the tenements actually worked. So there's hidden economics. My big point is, so 3 big points. 1, we're not very good at doing this stuff. Tony Pidgley and his brick on brick. 2, good news. We do know where we're going, I think, in a big sense. And it's these 3 things. We need to understand aging, technology, and inequality. And third, if we take engineering and medicine seriously and try and find people in extreme places, including Glasgow, and then actually talk to them, you find really interesting ideas about how resilience works in economics.
Thank you very much, Richard. We've guaranteed that I'm going to get your book. Now, can I just get a bit of advice from my colleagues, because we're at 7 o'clock now, and I just need to know how much time I've got, especially for our online audience. So 25 minutes, that's brilliant. Okay, so now it's your turn to make comments, ask questions, and we'll get some online ones as well, and Graham there will very helpfully tell us about those. But let's start with the audience in the room. Who wants to make a point or ask a question? Yeah.
Hi there, good evening everyone. Thanks very much for the presentations. I think there's maybe 2 points that I wanted to pick up on. So I think first of all, in terms of climate change, I was kind of expecting that to be a big theme throughout tonight's discussion, and I think both of you kind of picked up on it to some extent. But for me, when we talk about economic resilience, climate change is the big issue. And I also think there's a conversation around climate change and also opportunity. So I think with resilience, we talk about challenges a lot. Actually, I think if there's an opportunity in resilience, it's that a place like Scotland, which is seen to be dealing with climate change, can then be seen as a resilient place to do business, to invest, or to live. So that's maybe a first question. And then a second one, more specifically about international trade. So I think Professor Muscatelli, you kind of picked up on this at the end of your presentation as well. But I wonder, with sort of international trade trends that we're seeing, so strategic economy in the European Union, or the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, are these things that will kind of increase our resilience, or will that turn against sort of trade liberalisation and openness actually be something that will decrease our resilience? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Anton, Richard, who wants to? Anton.
I'm happy to kick off, and they're 2 really good questions. I mean, I think in terms of, and I'm not a climate change or sort of expert, I'm not an energy economist, as you know. I mean, I think absolutely right. I think it changes in terms of which countries have the geography to be able to use ride the wave of net zero. I think you're absolutely right that some of these things come into play. Just in the same way as Scotland, for instance, has some advantage around some elements of renewable. Actually, many of the countries that are currently very resource poor, many of the sub-Saharan African countries, have huge advantage in terms of solar energy, etc. So, but you do need to think about a couple of things. Which one for the latter, for, as I mentioned, for poorer countries, you need that initial investment, and that's really tricky. I mean, I was recently in Malawi, actually visiting some of our research facilities. And it's remarkable to see how those solar power installations that have been made are doing fantastically for the country. They're generating excess power, actually, to the point that you could probably attract other industry there to absorb that excess power well beyond the need. But then you realize that actually charcoal is being produced through deforestation locally, because for the poorest in that economy, there's no other solution but that in order to survive. So we need to think about how we're going to fund that. And similarly, if we look at advanced economies like Scotland or indeed UK and indeed many others that are trying to make that transition, we face other challenges, which is around issues around how do we get things like baseload? Because there's no doubt that we had a strategy which has proved to expose us to less resilience, which was gas would be the bridging fuel. And now we've discovered it's not as easy. And therefore, the question is, what is it going to be? Storage, we don't have enough storage to be able to smooth how much, even if we increase our renewables, we won't have enough storage to deal with that. So what's going to give us baseload if it isn't gas? Not many options left there. It's probably nuclear, actually, which creates huge political problems. So there's some really difficult questions there. On the issue of trade, yeah, well, I'll keep it short. I mean, I've already mentioned it. You're absolutely right. In theory, economists will tell you that interventions of this type, where a country like the US, through the likes of the Inflation Reduction Act, should be helpful across the world because it's trying to address one of the big issues that the US has in terms of energy transition. But I think one of the lessons, because of the impact that then has on trade, is that it can create some real geopolitical tensions potentially. And this is, again, why you need greater policy coordination. I'm not sure, as I said during my presentation, that our institutions are set up for that. Our current institutions, whether it's the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, were all created in the 1940s to deal with the 1930s. We don't have collective decision-making and coordination except through informal fora like the G20 or G7 that allow us to deal with the kind of difficult tensions that you pointed out. So absolutely, I think there's some real issues there that make the challenge towards climate change much more arduous than it would be with some degree of collective action and collective decision making globally.
Richard?
Yeah, I think they're both really great questions. On the first one, I think I'll just try and be a bit provocative. Of course, we all understand, or actually, we don't all understand. Lots of people disagree with it, right? So I'm not a climate change denier in any sense, but we need to kind of have serious conversations about lots and lots of different things. And so in terms of this, and when I go out and talk about these risks and things, I think climate is a huge issue. One of the chapters in there, it's not really about climate, it's about environmental degradation, particularly of rainforests. But in terms of our national conversation, what needs to have more injected into it, I would actually say the economics of aging and the economics of intergenerational inequality in this country need more airtime. Okay, and so that's why personally I don't focus on it, just because in some sense, we talk about climate a lot. We have COP, everything. All I mean, you guys will know better than me, but like civil servants at the end of their ministerial briefings, now they're encouraged. Every single policy needs to have a bit on climate, right? It needs to be like that also with, I think, aging and intergenerational inequality. These things are going to come and they're going to hit us, and they divide a society. That's the sort of downside bit. On your opportunities, I was in Belfast last week, and some similar themes with this city, and particularly the Harland and Wolff cranes, which are like almost as they are sort of as famous there as sort of Fairfield will be down in Govan here. And if you look under the cranes now, a massively optimistic sign that would have been empty for years. They're now making the are they called wings or blades of the huge new generation of wind turbines. So so absolutely there's an opportunity there. On trade, again, I think we need a new approach to how we think about it. Everyone on this room, I would say, if there's one person who's not a part of these trades, I would be very surprised. Phones and fast fashion, right? Everybody is involved in those, and I think they have quite different stories. One essentially has a supply chain that much of it ends up in China, and we've seen recently developments at Foxconn. I'm not sure if people have followed that, but that's one of the main producers of the iPhone. And we also know that fast fashion has caused considerable concern in Bangladesh. The easy way to think about this is, maybe we need to kind of shorten supply chains and so on, but the two are different. If you actually follow what's happened in Bangladesh, again, of course, factories have to be safe, and they had the Rana Plaza disaster. But one of the groups that was really hard hit by the lockdown, which stopped shopping in the UK, were Bangladeshi women who worked in their garment industry, right? How many people in UK trade policy have actually been and interviewed those people? They're only kind of 4 chains down the line, and we affect their lives. So I'm just saying it's really difficult, and things that might seem the same, like the supply chain for this thing and the supply chain for this shirt, have very different economic stories.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take another question here and then we'll go online. Just on that last point, can I just encourage everyone to have a wee look, use your iPhone if you must, but have a wee look at Unfolded website, which actually makes a really serious attempt to deal with precisely that, and produces some nice kit as it happens as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Lisa McSorley, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. 2 quick questions. The first one, Sir Anton, you talked about the development of macroeconomics, mainly happening in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. Do you think that we need a new programme of research in macroeconomics to deal with current and future challenges? And how do you see that working in terms of macroeconomics to help us prevent and respond to shocks? Second question for Richard. I was interested to see Tallinn in Estonia up as one of your success stories. I agree, and I've done quite a bit of work in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's been a success story for the past 20 years. However, the current energy shock is currently undermining a lot of the economic progress that's been made in Central and Eastern Europe over the past 20 years. Do you think that means that we need different types of resilience to respond to different types of shocks? And maybe if one place can withstand one shock, does it automatically mean it will be resilient against future shocks? Thanks.
Richard, do you want to go?
Yeah, so Tallinn, for those that don't know, and I didn't know before I started researching it, is the capital of Estonia. Why is it interesting? It's interesting because they had a very, very difficult time as part of the USSR, which is all, again, that goes down to very human stories. It's all to do with language. Estonian is very long way from Russian. And so the story goes that the Estonians weren't really trusted under the USSR. And when it came out of the USSR, its economy was completely destroyed. And and they made a really big bet, as they call it. They actually call it their big bet on technology. And they put technology at the heart of the economy. This is in 1992. And through that have developed Skype, and from Skype, then countless other technology firms. Their public sector, I think something like 97% of forms have gone. The legislature is all digitized. And the main thing I would take from that, everybody has faced difficulties in terms of COVID. I think the thing that's good about Tallinn and the lessons that the UK needs to learn, and it's almost, I'm sorry to say, a bit of a flip side of what Glasgow lost, is a place needs to have a really clear long-run industrial policy, I think. Everybody in Estonia knows, like, if you want to get ahead, you go into technology. Similarly, you know, up until, I don't know, when you would date it, the start of the Second World War, everyone here knew there's going to be jobs in or around shipbuilding. And that's one of the things I think we've lost as a country. We don't have a really clear industrial policy, and it's something we should develop. And that's the reason to learn from Estonia, I think.
Anton, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, yes is the answer to your question, Lisa. I think we do need to invest more in research in macro. A lot of the advances in macro came during that period of the Great Moderation. It was suddenly looking at a period in which external shocks were much smaller. And it's back to Richard's point. It's not very interesting when you're dealing with shocks that all keep you very close to the average or median path. But having experienced two major shocks, it actually does begin to unveil different issues about the resilience of our institutions, macroeconomic institutions that we put into place, like central banks, independent central banks. We've put in place in most countries, with the exception of one or two that were rather older. Most of them were put in place between the late 1980s and the sort of late 1990s. So, you know, how have they performed, for instance? What do we learn about these big shocks and how they, you know, the impact they have in the medium and long term in terms of big trends like technological investment, like productivity? And I don't think we know enough about those. And, you know, because macroeconomics for such a long period basically can, you know, sort of took these longer term effects and just took them out effectively and just superimposed them. Essentially, we've lost, I think, some of that richness that we might be interested in. So yes, you do need to invest in that. You do need to understand how macroeconomies respond to more extreme shocks, if you like.
Okay, I'm going to take Graham. Do you have a couple online?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. So first question is, do we think that economics has been captured by mathematicians and we need to do more to learn from social scientists? So there's lots of comments about learning from people with lived experience, and that builds on Richard's point there. And then secondly, for economic policymakers, so economic policymakers are taught to weight things with certainty more than things with uncertainty, and taught to weight the short term and discount the future. So does that philosophy and that teaching of economics not harm long-term decision-making if the payoff in the future is potentially uncertain, if it's long-term benefits such as tackling climate change, but the short-term action is higher taxes? So you weight the short term and discount the future.
Anton.
Shall I have a go perhaps at well, I could have a quick go at both of them, and then I think Richard gave a very good example of why you need a richer narrative than simply looking at what economists use in terms of models. And for those of you who don't know what that debate's about, economists often, in order to make their models tractable, tend to strip out things, because otherwise it's too complicated. It's the same reason why engineers tend to focus on the things that they think matters most to the trajectory of a vehicle or whatever. They tend to focus on and they factor out things that are less important. But the problem is, of course, when these factors become important, then the danger is your models become oversimplified and not very reliable. So I think, you know, what again, it's back to Richard's key point, which is in some cases, actually, what happens at the extremes reveals things that you wouldn't find out by simply looking at a very simple model, which focuses only on very small shocks. So So the answer is yes, we could probably learn, but I think one of the dangers of making your models too general is that actually they become pretty much intractable and anything can happen. So I think there's a space for both, to be honest. I think formalism in economics has some advantages when you're dealing with specific questions, but it's back to the point I made earlier. It's the same humility that policymakers have to have during uncertain times. Economists have to have the same humility when they're trying to deal with complicated problems that their models cannot handle. And what you get from other social sciences is often insights that you wouldn't get simply by focusing on only the economic factors. As for the issue of the discounting, it's a really good point. And then again, discounting has a particular reason, but again, it's horses for courses. Clearly, standard models of economic growth are really pointless in a situation where you've got a carbon budget that's binding in 20 years' time. And so to try and use it in that sort of context in an unfettered way is crazy. And frankly, any economist who simply does that without, when the bigger question is, what are we going to do with the remaining carbon budget? But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that the tools that economists have in that context are totally useless. It's just that you need to keep in mind what the binding constraint is, which is what most economists recognize as a good place to start. So sorry, it's probably not a great answer to this, but I don't think discounting the future is bad in itself. I think it's back to standing back from the problem and saying, be careful about what you do when you're discounting the future, when in fact the binding constraint is something else, which, in the case of climate change, the carbon budget.
Richard?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Just widen out on the maths one. I think data is actually the current risk, not maths. And that might seem a bit weird because I actually teach data science. What I mean by that is people have got obsessed with data. Data's really cool. And people think that just because they've got a data set, they know the answer to a question. And that's patently not the case. Like if you'd got data on the Glasgow tenements, there wasn't data on the fact that everybody was loaning each other money, everybody was helping each other when they were people were unemployed and so on. So there wasn't that data, and so people didn't take account of it. Similarly, you'd never get data on that story about gold. There's no data on how the prison economy stuff works. So you've got to be careful about data as well. So it definitely needs sociology, needs stories and stuff. And then on discount rates, it's difficult because they're used to try to appropriately allocate public money, and it is taxpayers' money at the end of the day. That said, I do think that in general, since about the 70s, we do need to, so this is not a party political thing, it's not a country-based thing, take a hard look at ourselves and compare ourselves to the generations that bequeathed us things like, well, deepening the Clyde. Would you have ever done that on a discounted future, unexpected, forward-looking thing that we use these days? You probably wouldn't have done. And then Glasgow wouldn't have flourished. So, I think we need to think about it. And the reason is because people care about their grandkids and they don't care about them in a discounted way.
Thank you. Question here. Is there anyone else here? If not, we'll take yourself, sir. And then if we've got another online one, that would be grand.
Yeah, it's interesting. I forgot your name.
Me, go ahead.
Roger. I'm an engineer, a weapons systems engineer. I then became a broker in London. I've come back, I've been back here a while, and I've gone back to a socially deprived area. And all the language and measuring sticks that go with that. For the past decade, I've been working with the human capital, that's the residents, on what they want and how they go. And today, we had a conversation about working with an academic on sustainable. So our next decade is about to make sure that the 5-year-old kids who will see Santa on Saturday, in 10 years' time, when they're ready to go to work or go to college, what kind of place do we want? That means we're going to have to break a lot of eggshells and upset a lot of people. Like your builder, it's about entrepreneurial. Never used that language. So you get a whole bunch of jargon in the way of improving it. That's the challenge, is to get rid of a whole bunch of people who are stopping Scotland, Glasgow, picking itself up. It's also taking out a whole lot of money that's not reaching these communities. So they're quite happy. If I go through to cross-party, I go through the parliament, listen, I've been in your company earlier, when you were ministers. And then I listen to there, and I come back on the train to the community. It never gets there. So you've got a whole lack of buy-in from the residents because they don't trust. Therefore, the Scotland that will evolve for the 5-year-old has to be started again, picking up on some and saying, well, if it worked in the slums as it was, Cowcaddens, Gorbals, and they were then translated out to the periphery, they also brought their values with them. And that slum 50 years ago is now a socially deprived area.
Thank you very much. And I'll come to Richard and Anton after this one, and you pick up on both.
It's a general question about resilience of people. So we've spoken a bit about resilience of infrastructure and economies in that context, but post-pandemic, a lot of the economic resilience will be how people have coped through this crisis, particularly young people. So this is a question about whether or not we can say a bit more about what we can do to potentially target or sort or address the economic disadvantage that will impact particularly young people through the crisis.
Okay, thanks very much. Anton, do you want to pick that one up, and then I'll come to Richard?
Yeah, and it's actually, there's interesting parallels between the two questions because it's to do with the human factor. And again, it's back to actually a point that Richard made earlier. I think sometimes as economists, we're too quick at just focusing on the figures and ignoring what's behind that. And I think the kind of storytelling that is within extreme economies actually tells you just how important that human dimension is. It's another reason why the rest of the social sciences, are really important. I mean, often as economists, we just look at data and, look at data from 1946 as if it was the same as data from 1971. It isn't. I mean, what happened in 1946 was, it's an era I've heard a lot about because it happened to be when my father was 18, for instance. It was a rather different life for an 18-year-old in post-war Europe than it was in 1971 for an 18-year-old. So I think the point is this, and I think post-COVID, I think we're seeing some really terrible sort of impacts of COVID on what is done to some economic decision making. People feeling, they've been hit hard. What is done around their own sort of ability to cope around their own economic activity. We've seen people leaving the workforce. Is that a permanent effect or a temporary effect? What's it done more generally to health and well-being? I think it's going to be. I think economists, I don't have an answer for you, but I think economists have to basically be much more humble again in the same answer as before to the question about mathematics and formalism. I think we need to actually try to see what impact will these forces, which are not found in any economic data, they're not found in my GDP data, they're not found in my employment data. What does it tell you about the way in which we manage our societies in the next few years following these major shocks? And I don't think we as economists spend a lot of time thinking about that. And that's why the narrative approach, the more qualitative approach, can actually be very helpful.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, on you obviously know way more about it than me, but I did visit the city loads of times, and I do, pride myself on kind of doing my journalism properly, and I'd spent a lot of time in Govan, a lot of time in Gorbals, but then also on the peripheral estates, on Rukazi and Easterhouse. And I just think it was an example of bad policy. I think it's quite quite easy to say that. I mean, you can't expect people, whatever you thought of the slums, you can't expect to move people out to peripheral estates where there's no bus link to get there. I mean, it's not very complicated. Like, we've got public policy makers here, and the shame is there are elements of it. There was actually an aspirational idea. People wanted to get to the fresh air of Easterhouse, right, and Rukazi, and but they just didn't put any shops or bus links or pubs or anything. So I don't know. I just think sometimes you just got to say that was a mistake. It was there were some bad policies there. What do we need today? There are some really good things that we've had as a country, to not be a sort of doomsday sort of person. One is the cross-party agreement we've got on minimum wages, which was introduced obviously by Tony Blair in '97, and then doubled down on essentially in the 2015-2016 budget by George Osborne. People who you might think are sort of quite different, maybe don't think that different. Anyway, the point is, it doesn't really matter what you think about the politics. What we've seen is that the difference between the medians, the person in the middle, and then the person at the bottom of the income distribution, and I would argue that's the difference you should care about in inequality. Like, I don't really care what the superstars get versus the median. I care much more about what the people having a tough time versus the median get. That difference has been almost eroded away by the continual uprating in the minimum wage. So that's good for young people. When we just held in Bristol this big Festival of Economics, which Graham was at, and there's loads of young people there. When you talk to them, there's two things they face. People just want to start in life, and what's happening with low pay, because you start at the bottom of the ladder, so you end up on that. That's really good. Things that are really bad, two things they face. One is housing, rent. It's just unacceptably high. It's not that difficult to build houses. We've known how to do it for sort of, I don't know, a historian can tell me, but millennia. And then the second one, and I'm sort of undermining my own career here in part, but educational costs and university fees. So we're just sending young people out and face two massive costs. So we are able to sort some things in good public policy. The minimum wage is a great one. No party I don't think, will now undermine that in the UK. But housing and education really need a new approach.
Although, of course, here in Scotland, we don't have fees.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's not to say that there isn't an economic
England
challenge for our
Wales
students. I wouldn't want to dismiss that for a second. And a better minimum wage.
Yeah.
And honestly, it wasn't me that moved people out to Rukazi. Right? We know buses. And you're quite right, actually. Some of those areas, you look at them now and you think, that's completely mad. And you wouldn't want to live there, actually, if it was you. Anyway, we've run out of time. I know there's so much more, actually, we could talk about. And I suspect as we think, those of us who've been listening tonight, as we think more about what Richard and Anton and Linda have said, we're going to have more questions and more things to think about. So we've got some books to read. We've got some articles that we can look up and see what we think about. We can have a look at what is the well-being economy. What does that mean? What does that look like? And how do we do that transitioning that you touched upon yourself between where we are now and capture the opportunities that do exist in green energy, with all the challenges around that and the difficulties in making that transition. But my job now is to close us off, to thank Anton, Richard and Linda for their contributions, to thank Mike and Graham for what they've done with us tonight, to thank to our staff, Linda, Sam, Tapestry Events, who made sure that the mics came on when they needed to come on and went off when they needed to go off, and Kieran, who is largely responsible for the film that you saw at the outset and is busy working to add to that film for when we finish. But lastly, to thank all of those who've joined us online. I really appreciate you taking the time, and all of you who've given us your time tonight. Really appreciate you being here. I hope you found it interesting and useful. When we set the date for the final in this series of seminars, We'll be sure to publicise that widely, and I hope you'll be able to come back and join us then and hear some of the key themes that have emerged from the whole Global Shock series. Certainly what's emerged is the need for more discussion and more contributions and more public policy makers listening to what people like yourselves have got to say. But for now, thanks very much and safe home. Thank you.